Sermon today, a few thoughts on the theme of Epiphany. Epiphany was on Wednesday, this past week. And traditionally, Epiphany is celebrated by the Western Church, of which we're part of, on the Sunday before Epiphany Day. But in view of what we've gotten used to, in a time when the terms unprecedented and shocking and so forth no longer have any meaning, and when we're in a time where irony and satire died a slow death, when exactly we celebrate Epiphany, whether it's on the Sunday before or after Epiphany Day, doesn't seem to me to be that important an issue. So here we are on the Sunday after Epiphany Day, thinking about Epiphany and trying to get a few thoughts together for today's sermon. It's normally quite a struggle for me, but this was even a more difficult project over the past few days. And I think many of us experienced what was even more acute this day to me, that you look at Wednesday and it feels like it's a year ago. And you look at last year and sometimes it feels like it yesterday. So a loss of a proper sense of time is still often with me. So I looked at trying to ground me for Epiphany. I thought, let me just look at last year's service and where we were, trying to gauge from that what was on the agenda or what was current that time. And looking at the sermon, I noticed that I even was able to bring some humor into the service or the sermon. There was the story of the two matriarchs that I relate to you in the church kitchen that was overheard, the one saying to the other, "You know, the virgin birth, I can't believe, but come on, that story of three wise men." And then there's Jay Leno's story at that stage. He had on his show the comment that there were no nativity scenes in Washington, D.C. at that stage last year. And he said it had nothing to do with the war on Christmas or anything like that, but the reason for no nativity scenes in Washington, D.C. was that they couldn't find the Virgin or three wise men in all of D.C. And then I relate the story as well of the feminists who were saying to each other, yes, the wise people, the individuals involved there, the three kings, they were definitely men. Because women would have asked directions so that they would have arrived on time. They would have brought practical gifts. They would have helped to deliver the baby. They would have cleaned the stable and made casseroles for a week. I thought perhaps it is good to, even if it's humor from last year, try and also attempt to smile in these days. Because on Wednesday, what happened was Epiphany, but also an epiphany of a more ominous, disturbing nature, some really serious events that is sobering to put it mildly. And like so many others, I tried to get my head around about what I was observing, what I was seeing, and filled with so many emotions, disbelief, embarrassment, anger, and shock, and some gratitude thrown in there as well. I couldn't believe how easy a perimeter around our capital was broken, and I couldn't believe people just streaming in through that one door and other doors being broken, etc. You all observed it, and we are all still trying, I think, to understand what we saw. And as somebody from the congregation phoned me, asked a question to me, then what's going on? Why is there nobody else? Why aren't other security people showing up to try and restore order? It was on a day of Epiphany for me. Most of it, not something that I wish I had to realize. Epiphany coming from the Greek word epiphaneia, which means to come to an insight, to get a revelation, a new understanding. And it was indeed for me a day of Epiphany. The first Epiphany, the realization was for me how vulnerable our democracy really is, how fragile it is. It could have gone with small changes in events and incidentals, could have gone terribly wrong. And for one instance, we could have perhaps still be dealing with a hostage situation in our capital. It was also an epiphany for me around the phrase, "This is not who we are," referring to what we've been saying to each other about many things as Americans. This is not part of our national makeup. That I had to come to the somber and the sobering acknowledgement that what we observed there was indeed part of our collective national makeup. This is not behavior and motives, projects, objectives on the fringes of society. This is part of mainstream national life. And I think everybody looking at what was happening also have to admit, yes, the discrepancy between protests or events where Black Lives Matter people, normally more African American in composition, taking place, that this was different. There wasn't at all sufficient or an overwhelming presence of people to keep the order and to protect property, if nothing else. It was also an epiphany for me, and this acknowledgement that yes, this is part of our collective makeup. Nothing on the fringes, but at the heart of who we are or what we have become, was what I read in commentary from around the world, and from my continent, that I came from a journalist from Kenya writing for The Guardian, Patrick Katara, and let me read to you what he wrote on his commentary about the panel talking about elections worldwide and also about the American election. He said, "It's now clear that those gurus, the Americans, were simply fellow travelers whose wealth had more to do with iniquity than nirvana." Nirvana referencing America. In many cases, third world elections were run better than elections in the US. And as one correspondent in Colombia reminded, a US host puffed up with ideas of superiority, he said, "We haven't had any mobs storming the Congress here for several decades." Sobering words, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but we have to take note of that, of how, at least in that part of the world, America is seen by some. And the third epiphany that I had, that was also for me very telling and very disturbing, was the effect of all of this on the market. I made a point of it, apart from flipping channels to see what the sources of information were relaying to their viewers. I made a point of also looking at the markets, looking at the indices, what was happening, because it is accepted, and I still think it holds true, that the market does not like instability, does not like uncertainty. And the astonishing thing for me was that the markets did not blink. There wasn't any serious deviation in the trends. It just carried on. The Dow ended up quite a bit high. The Nasdaq recovered most of its losses from its low point for the day, and the next day it continued that trend. The markets did not blink. And at a time when so many people are suffering and so many jobs were lost in December and so forth, this was for me an illustration that the market is not even bothered by instability in the center, at the heart of our democracy. It seems that there are two different universes for that as well. The one for the regular people, and then the one for the people that through their wealth, influence, and are affected by the stock market. The disconnect just, to me, seemed disturbing. And perhaps the most sobering epiphany for me was looking on that day and over the last few days at the take and what was taken from the events and how it was projected. And I don't even want to use the word how it was spun, but what the different channels that people prefer to watch, where they get their information and through which their epistemological universe, their universe of knowledge, are constructed. Because I thought, this was a pivotal moment, a point where people would say, all right, let's recalibrate, let's apply the brakes, and let's try to arrive at the collective view on what is the truth. And less provide less opinion and theories and so forth, but let's try collectively as Americans through our coverage of this to arrive at the truth. Because I remember the words of Gabriel Sterling, that official, the chief election official in the office of the Secretary of State in Georgia, Gabriel Sterling, that a few weeks ago said, we have to stop the lies. He said, someone's going to get hurt, somebody's going to get shot, someone's going to get killed. But to my shock, the narratives of most of the channels stayed the same. What do we make of all this? Where do we stand? What shall we say? What should our response be as God's people? We've just listened to Katie reading to us the story, a narrative that we find in the Gospel according to Matthew of the wise men coming to pay homage to Jesus. If you're in the Western tradition, as we are, we follow the theme of the three, or the wise men. We don't know that they were three. We think they were three because there were three gifts that they brought. If you're in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the baptism of Jesus is what it is about. But for us, listening to that narrative of the three kings again, we read about these outsiders, these foreigners, with their wisdom, arriving to pay homage, arriving with their wisdom, and in the process encountering the rule of King Herod, a king that was brutal with his lust for power, a king that was so brutal and that longed after unfettered and unlimited and uncontrolled power, to the extent that he would kill off all the male descendants that could perhaps be his successor. And these wise individuals, with their wisdom, for me represents the battle between a wisdom that sustains what is good and a wisdom that is able to prevail in spite of power that is corrupting and corrupted, power that is destructive, because its only objective is to have power, unrestricted power, absolute power. And we have a name for it. We call it dictatorship, among other names. It is a power with disregard for the poor, for the downtrodden, for the powerless. It is a power not born out of compassion, and a power that is exercised through fear, and who finds a comfortable companion and a bedfellow in violence, where nothing is out of bounds as long as power is maintained and power is grown. These wise individuals, for me, representing that wisdom that is able to be a counterbalance, and in the long run, through its resilience, was able, in the case of Herod, to prevail and to enable the message and the example, the legacy of that child that was born to prevail up to this day. And perhaps on this Epiphany Sunday, it will be good for us to have an epiphany of the work that awaits us as God's people, as people of the way that was able to survive the tyranny of a king like Herod. And perhaps it is for us necessary to have the epiphany to hear the words from the letter to the Hebrews that says, "Lift up your tired hands then, and strengthen your trembling knees." And also the words of the prophet of Isaiah when he said, "But those that wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not grow faint." As God's people, we no longer have the luxury to be bystanders. We no longer have the luxury to expend energy to try and find excuses for inaction. We can no longer look away in a polite and accommodating way. We have to rise above partisan politics and embrace our calling to be God's people, people of the way, people of compassion and justice. We have to have that epiphany that the long arc of the universe only bends towards justice if we, the people of the way, the people of the beloved community, do the work that we are called to do, and if we are the people enabling that arc to bend towards justice. It is perhaps for us necessary to have the epiphany. If we do that, then our hallowed halls of governing the people's house, if we do our duty, will not be filled with the sound of gunfire, or not a place where mob violence and barbarism rule, not a place of utter havoc and destruction, a place of death. But if we do what we are called to do, if we are open to experience that epiphany, then the hallowed halls of governing will again become the city on the hill, and a place of peace for us and for the world, a place from which, in the words of Amos, justice rolls down like a river, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amen.